In 2013, two students, Duncan Drummond and Paul Morse, founded their indie gaming company Hopoo Games and released their first title, Risk-A-Rain, an indie roguelike platformer that set a new standard for the roguelike genre. Beautiful pixel art, a killer soundtrack, an interesting difficulty system, and addictive gameplay loop. Although Risk-A-Rain 1 had some flaws and is less revered than some of the other games in the genre, the game, world, and style that was built marks the precursor to one of the best, if not the best games in the genre, its sequel, Risk-A-Rain 2. Risk-A-Rain 2 is like what The Dark Knight was to Batman Begins, or what Judgment Day was to Terminator 1. Bigger, bolder, sexier.
It's as satisfying to me as coming is, as having sex with a woman and coming.
It's built upon the foundations made in the first, and establishing themselves as not only the best in their respective genres, but I'd say the best of all time. And to mark their 10-year anniversary, Hopoo Games released Risk-A-Rain Returns, a remaster of the original game with updated graphics, a multiplayer system overhaul, quality of life updates, and both new content to the franchise as well as imported content from Risk-A-Rain 2. It breathed new life into the original game and made it better in every regard, and I'd say replaced the original game entirely. I don't think you'll get anything out of playing the first game that Risk-A-Rain Returns doesn't do better. But in saying that, I do think it fails to fix some of the fundamental limitations and frustrations that I had with the original Risk-A-Rain 1. Now, this video was originally going to just be on Risk-A-Rain Returns, but when comparing it to Risk-A-Rain 2, I found it interesting that given the different perspectives in each game, Risk-A-Rain Returns being a 2D side-scroller and Risk-A-Rain 2 being 3D, each game had very different strengths and weaknesses, and as a result, these games stand so separate from one another that the experience you get from each is so different despite having the same source material and gameplay fundamentals. They are completely different experiences, so I figured I'd just talk a bit about both, as I find the comparisons between each interesting talking points. And so yeah, here are my thoughts on Risk-A-Rain, one of the best roguelike franchises to date. Risk-A-Rain Returns, a surprisingly faithful remaster of Risk-A-Rain 2013, is a 2D side-scroller roguelike with platforming elements. You find yourself crash-landed on an alien planet, host to a variety of aliens and monsters that aren't too happy with you gate-crashing their shit. The goal is to reach the teleporter located somewhere on the planet by fighting through hordes of enemies. Doing so earns you gold that you use to purchase chests, granting you access to a variety of items that give you bonuses to mobility, speed, utility, or damage, like the Mark 1 missile that has the chance to shoot homing rockets, to gamer goggles that give you a crit chance, to the bungus that heals you after 2 seconds of standing still, or hoppy feathers that grant you double jump. You can also purchase equipment like disposable rocket launchers that fire swarms of missiles to teleporters, adding to your character's arsenal and granting you a bit more choice to how you choose to play. You'll also find some of these multi-shop terminals along the way that let you pick out which item you want, granting some capacity for build variety, but is something that lacks a little bit in comparison to Risk-A-Rain 2, a topic that I'll touch on later. Eventually, you'll find and activate the teleporter, spawning a whole bunch of mobs, including the big boss that, upon killing and waiting out the timer, allows you to teleport to the next environment, where you'll continue to build up your arsenal, progressively getting stronger as the world progressively gets harder. You see, the difficulty scales with time. The longer you take, the more difficult the game becomes. The devs stated their main goal of this was to give the player a sense of urgency in their runs. Do I explore more to find more chests to upgrade my character whilst enemies become harder, or do I dip early and hope to find more items along the way whilst enemies remain a bit easier? This time pressure is the flame beneath the player's feet, driving the player forward and punishing them for dawdling. Eventually, you do get the option to teleport to the final level where you can confront the final boss, or you can choose to reroll worlds, continuing to build up your character, creating these god-defying builds as you just fuck up everything that appears on screen. It's this power fantasy that is the best thing about the Risk-A-Rain games. There comes a point where you just collect enough items and start smoking fools, ripping through bosses and running through enemies. It's getting to this point that is both the hardest part of the game and the most rewarding, with the goal of each run not to beat the game, but rather to get the god run, where you just get all the right items and just start to decimate anyone that tries to start something with you. There's no greater feeling than getting juiced off soldier syringes and seeing bosses' health bars melt as you show them the new meaning of what it means to be a god.
Do you think God stays in heaven because he too lives in fear of what he's created?
Each run is also given some variety with the game's wide selection of characters. There's like 10 characters in Risk Rain Returns, most of which are returning from Risk Rain 1. I think my favourite was the pilot, as I liked her little parachute and the fact that I could shoot up in an angle, as well as Loader, one of my favourites from Risk Rain 2, and the chef that I'm glad to have returned from Risk Rain 1. I will say that these do offer slightly different ways to play, but as you get later into runs, the variety within each character kinda gets limited, which is due to a few reasons which I'll touch upon later. Following the addition of it in Risk Rain 2, alternate abilities have also been added to each character, unlocked through either certain in-game challenges or by completing Prismic Trials, a set of mini-games that I think above all else are the best addition to this game, not just compared to the original, but to Risk Rain 2 as well. These challenges are actually so much fun, from small tower defense-like modes to time trials to platforming mini-games to survival modes. These mini-games just give such a breath of fresh air to the game and the characters, and provide a different game besides just repeating runs and running the gauntlet. I can't overstate how much fun I had with these trials, with some of them being genuinely difficult, like jumping puzzles that feel like they were pulled from Celeste, to time trials feeling like something from Speed Races. I put hours into these challenges, they're just so good, and I like how they act as an alternative route to unlocking character abilities, with each challenge built upon the functionality of each new ability, really giving you space to learn how it works and trial it out, even if it is an ability that I would probably never use otherwise. I was actually surprised how similar this game was compared to the original, given the amount of new stuff that was added in Risk Rain 2, like the Void items, 3D printers, the Lunar items. I was kind of expecting to see a lot of these appear in the remake, however they weren't, and although at first I was kind of disappointed, I think ultimately it was for the best, as it separates this game from the second, keeping it more true to the original and stopping it from feeling like a 2D version of Risk Rain 2. It's a faithful remake of the first game, which I appreciate, with some much needed quality of life and system updates. Quickly touching on the graphics, although I like the more pixel art style of the first Risk Rain, I do really like the updated graphics of Risk Rain Returns. It feels smoother, things are a lot easier to see and differentiate from one another, and it gives the game a better sense of flow, I feel. And the style really helps you appreciate a lot more detail in the enemy and character designs, as the game isn't as blurred, which is inherent when using pixel art. I mean, this is still pixel art, but it's just more pixels than the first, if that makes sense. It's no longer just 8-bit, rather it's like 32-bit. I don't know what I'm saying, but the game looks great, and I love the detail in the character and enemy animations. It has a much more hand-drawn feel to it, which makes it feel a lot more homely in a way, like there's some personal touch to it. Other quality of life upgrades include redoing the multiplayer servers. Before in Risk Rain 1 you had to port forward in order to play co-op, now it's just super easy to host and join other people's games. I like that they removed the need to have to entirely clear the map of enemies before you can use the teleporter, which was such a pain in the ass in the first game, and I like that there's a lot more achievements and a lot more stuff to unlock, which is one of the few things I think this game does better than Risk Rain 2, as in Risk Rain 2 there felt like there was a lot of achievements missing. Like you got achievements for doing the prismatic trials and getting all the artifacts, but there were no achievements for like killing the final secret boss in the Survivors of the Void DLC. I know achievements are a small thing, but it's another driving force to try and beat that boss, and you know, you have something to show for it, to show that you completed it. Risk Rain Returns has plenty of achievements, some might argue too much, but a lot of them are fun and you rack them up pretty quickly, and I'd say it's better to have too many than too little. Overall, I've enjoyed my time with Risk Rain Returns. I think it's a good replacement for Risk Rain 1, which had some issues in it that made it harder to get into, particularly in respect to modern audiences and modern expectations, like having to port forward to play co-op and all that. And I think more than anything, Risk Rain Returns makes the game much more accessible, as well as fleshes the game out a lot more, with the trials and the alternate abilities, all the achievements, adding some depth to the game. However, despite all the updates and changes, I think some of the fundamental limitations that were present in the original Risk Rain are still lurking. Limitations that are amplified given the acclaim, success, and popularity of its successor, one of the best roguelikes to date, Risk Rain 2. I still remember the release of Risk Rain 2 so vividly. I've been tracking the game's development for months, ever since its announcement.
Naughty, naughty, you teasing me, you naughty, naughty.
Until one day, there it was. No announcement, just sitting there staring at me from the front page. And not only was it out, but the devs were doing a promotion where it was buy one game, get a second copy free. How fucking goated is that? From the get-go, this game was fucking awesome. The update to a 3D engine was one of those things that you never knew you needed until you had it. The power fantasy was even more palpable and amplified by the way that the game captured a sense of scale. As you see the terrain rise up around you, fighting these colossal bosses that tower over you, and that feeling of getting stronger and overcoming great and towering odds was so addictive. It was great being able to look out at the surrounding landscape and seeing your buddies fighting alongside you, shooting up their own shit on the other side of the map. and each update added more items, more environments, more bosses, and all of them so unique to the previous. I love their remakes of the original maps like Rally Point Delta or Titanic Plains, and most of the new maps were great too. Siren's Call, where everything just rises up around you, boasting so much elevation but still allowing you to clearly see most of the map, and its hidden boss with a chance to get that red item is great. I love the Grove Tender boss, the design of it is just so cool. And the Survivors of the Void DLC is awesome, with the Void items really adding a new element to the game and allowing you to make some pretty ridiculous builds. This game is a masterpiece and an absolute banger, and I couldn't recommend it more. But again, it follows the exact same premise as Risk of Rain 1. It doesn't really do anything different, especially when the game first released in early access, and it only had a couple of levels and a couple of survivors and not nearly as many items as it does now. I mean, it didn't even have an endgame, yet despite that, it felt so much better to play than the original. I think the reason why that is that majority of the issues I had with Risk of Rain 1, and to be honest are issues that I still kind of have with Risk of Rain Returns, came from the nature of the game being in 2D. Risk of Rain Returns is hard, much harder than Risk of Rain 2. Fundamentally, it's a mobility problem, and it all stems from the limitations of the game being in 2D. You see, being in 2D, you are limited by the number of planes you can move in, obviously. Up, down, left, right, but with dodging, when all the enemies shoot out attacks horizontally, you now only have one plane to dodge in, the vertical plane. And so you're really only left with three options: jump over the attack, use an ability to dodge it, or just eat it. Now for games like Dead Cells, this isn't an issue because it's a lot more one-on-one combat, it's a lot more intimate. In Risk of Rain, so many enemies end up on screen that there eventually comes a point where there's just no possible way to dodge an attack, as your ability will always be on cooldown, and there's just so much stuff attacking you at once that you can't jump over everything. As such, you're forced to play a lot more defensively and run away from fights to heal up that you just waste so much time, and in doing so, make the game more difficult. Likewise, with attacking, majority of the characters have attacks that shoot out horizontally, and as such, you can only hit enemies on the same level as you. This is fine in most scenarios when the game is flat. However, Risk of Rain Returns is a game that not only has a lot of verticality, but a lot of enemies that use this verticality. I think it's safe to say that the two most frustrating enemy types in this game are the birds that dive bomb you from all angles, or these robot dudes that can shoot you through walls and in any direction. The issue here is that you can't actually attack these birds because all you can usually do is attack horizontally unless you have items, and so you're just waiting for these birds to dive bomb you.
And Max Sherwood's scooter ride really gets going.
Some characters allow you to shoot diagonally, like the pilot, which is part of the reason why I like her so much, but it makes some of the other characters a lot harder to play. And the other issue that is inherent with this 2D perspective is enemy targeting. When enemies are on the same plane as you, most of your attacks hit the nearest enemy, and so you could be fighting a boss or an elite, and then some smaller mob just wanders out in the firing line, and you instead start damaging that one instead of the boss. As a result, you're more drawn to the items that do area of attack damage, like the Frost Relic, or things like Gasoline or Wisp in a Bottle that damages groups of enemies, and so each run kind of merges into the same as you gravitate towards similar builds each time. As such, the game lacks a sense of build variety, as the 2D perspective kind of guides you into playing a particular way. One of my favourite things in Risk of Rain 2 are those 3D printers, where you can cash in items of the same value and colour to get a particular item and you can just stack them up. And although in most cases it does ruin your build, it's being able to make that choice that matters. Like stacking up gasolines on Acrid so that when you kill an enemy it just lights the whole map on fire. It's these runs that make Risk of Rain 2 so funny, as they're so distinct from one another. Risk of Rain 1 doesn't have that, and sadly neither does Risk of Rain Returns, which leaves the game purely relying on RNG, meaning that each run feels relatively the same. You do get some choice from those multi-shop terminals, but not enough to make a difference, and so yeah, you just end up picking a character more for mobility than their attacks. It makes the late game feel kinda samey regardless of which character you pick. Exploration is also a lot harder and frustrating in a 2D environment too, given that your field of view is quite restricted, which makes the maps a lot harder to navigate. And it feels like you get punished more for choosing to explore given how blind you are just wandering around the map. I've been lost countless times looking for chests, or falling off a ledge and plummeting to the bottom of the map, and I waste so much time getting back to where I was that it often feels more worth it to just head for the teleporter instead. And a lot of these maps are so vertical that it feels like there's a lot of empty space, and you have no indication of where you need to go or what's ahead of you, that for majority of each run you feel like you're stumbling around blindly. When you're playing multiplayer, this isn't so bad as you have 4 people looking for the teleporter, but solo, you can spend so long just trying to find the teleporter that it feels like you're getting punished for no reason given the difficulty scaling. I know it's impossible to fix this given its presentation, like this limitation is inherent with that 2D presentation, but I think given the context of the second game, it kind of reminds me how frustrating this was in the first game and why I didn't really gel with the first game in the first place. and as such it feels better to play this game co-op rather than solo, given that you have 4 people searching for the telly at the same time. Once you run through maps a few times, you do get a better sense of their layout, but yeah, I feel like I'm forced to give up a lot more loot in order to stay on time, or that I waste so much time looking for the teleporter that I don't get enough loot, or I spend so much time searching that enemies just outscale me naturally, and that is frustrating as I couldn't help that. I actively tried to find the telly as soon as possible, and I still got outscaled because I have no idea where I'm going. I feel like it wouldn't change much or take much away if an indicator was added pointing you towards the telly. I know that feels kind of sacrilegious, as that's never been what these games have been about, but it does make the game pretty frustrating when I'm forced to backtrack because I missed one tiny cutout or some side lane that the teleporter was hiding in, and it's not like I'm not going to explore anyway. No one's goal is to just gun it for the teleporter. Everyone wants loot. It would just cut out a lot of wasted time, I feel. And unfortunately, these frustrations are the same frustrations I had with the original Risk of Rain. And so it's a bit of a shame to see them return. I was hoping to see more of an attempt to fix them. Other than those, a ping system would be nice to implement too. That would be a really nice addition specifically to multiplayer and would help ease up the exploration side of things and encourage more non-verbal communication between players, which I think would be a worthwhile addition given how much better this game feels to play in multiplayer. Look, ultimately, I really like what they've done with this game. I think it's a great remaster that is better than the original in every regard, and I think it safely replaces it entirely, whilst injecting it with new content and making it much more accessible for both newer audiences and returning players. The added trials are awesome and so much fun, and I think it's one of the rare things that this game does better than the second, and it captures the best parts and the fundamentals of that Risk of Rain experience, that gameplay loop, that power fantasy, that chaos. But sadly, although few, the issues I had with this game feel great, and I recognize that that comes from a bias of me really liking Risk of Rain 2, part of which was because it fixed the issues that I had with the original Risk of Rain, issues that return here. And as such, for players who liked Risk of Rain 1, I think this game will give you everything you wanted and some. Again, it's an awesome and faithful remaster with enough polish and new content to warrant the price tag. It's a good game. But for those who couldn't get into the first game for reasons other than the multiplayer setup, I think whatever that reason was will still be present, as although it adds, it doesn't necessarily fix. And it doesn't have to. It's a remaster in the end. And if those issues or frustrations aren't a problem for you, then I'm happy for you, man. I still had a blast playing Risk of Rain 1, and I had a blast playing this game. But for new players to the franchise, I'd probably point them towards Risk of Rain 2 first. And for players who liked Risk of Rain 2 and are wondering whether or not they should try this out, I'd say that unless you're tired of Risk of Rain 2, or you're not a fan of the scale of it, and you're looking for a much more tightened up experience, I'd probably stick to that one. Speaking of, Hoppo Games actually released a lot of announcements recently given its 10th anniversary, and with that was the first look at the next Risk of Rain 2 expansion, which looks sick. So I'll be waiting for that. But yeah, if you liked Risk of Rain Returns or have different opinions, let me know. I'd love to hear them in the comments. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and ciao ciao for now.